It's the kind of trade war twist that economists will be studying for decades, a geopolitical and economic domino effect that happened in plain sight, yet caught the US completely off guard. In less than 12 months, Canada has ripped away $3.2 billion worth of US dairy sales to Mexico. Not chipped away. Not gradually eroded. Ripped away, almost overnight, leaving America's dairy belt reeling and thousands of farmers wondering how their livelihoods collapsed so fast. For years, the US thought it had Mexico's dairy market locked in. Generations of trade deals, cultural proximity, and logistical convenience made the partnership feel unshakable. But in early 2025, one political decision, rooted in Donald Trump's tariff-first trade philosophy, set off a chain reaction that not only cost America billions but may have permanently handed one of its most profitable agricultural export markets to Canada. Before we break down how this happened, and why it might be impossible for the US to win this market back, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and tap the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the world's most important economic and political shifts. Because the story you're about to hear isn't just about dairy. It's about how fragile America's trade dominance really is. How Canada seized $3.2 billion in US dairy sales to Mexico. The first thing you have to understand is that Mexico isn't just a neighbor, it's one of America's most important agricultural customers. For decades, Mexico has been the #1 or #2 export destination for US dairy products, depending on the year. In 2024, American farmers sold nearly $4 billion worth of milk, cheese, and other dairy goods south of the border. The relationship seemed bulletproof. But Canada saw an opportunity. Even before Trump's new tariffs hit in February 2025, Canadian trade officials were quietly building relationships with Mexican importers. They knew that if they could convince Mexico to diversify its dairy suppliers, it would weaken US leverage in any future trade disputes. By mid-2025, Canada's efforts paid off. They didn't just nibble at the edges of America's market share, they took the whole pie. Mexican supermarkets that once stocked US brands like Land O'Lakes and Dean Foods began filling shelves with Canadian milk and cheese. Canadian butter started showing up in hotel kitchens and restaurant supply chains. Even schools began sourcing milk from Canadian processors. The February 2025 tariffs that triggered Mexico's pivot. So what triggered this sudden upheaval? In February 2025, Donald Trump's administration announced a new round of tariffs on a broad range of Mexican goods, everything from auto parts and steel to agricultural products like avocados and peppers. The official explanation was that these tariffs were designed to protect American jobs and industries, but Mexico saw it as a direct economic attack. Mexico didn't waste time responding. They imposed their own retaliatory tariffs, but more importantly, they began systematically reducing reliance on US imports. This wasn't just a tit-for-tat measure, it was a long-term shift in trade policy. Mexican officials made it clear, if the US wanted to play hardball, they would start building alternative supply chains that couldn't be disrupted by political games in Washington. That's where Canada stepped in. Ottawa moved quickly, offering Mexico a zero-tariff dairy trade deal and promising consistent supply regardless of US politics. For Mexican buyers tired of unpredictable price hikes and tariff threats, it was an easy decision. Within months, Canadian dairy shipments to Mexico skyrocketed, filling warehouses and retail shelves once dominated by American goods. Canada's zero-tariff advantage and ethical dairy standards. Here's the part a lot of people outside the dairy industry don't realize: Canada's competitive advantage wasn't just about avoiding tariffs. It was also about how they produce their dairy in the first place. Canada runs its dairy industry under a supply management system that tightly controls production, stabilizes prices, and enforces strict quality and animal welfare standards. To Mexican consumers, this translated into something powerful: trust. Canadian dairy was marketed as clean, ethically produced, and environmentally responsible. And in a time when food safety scandals have eroded public confidence in many global supply chains, that mattered. Canadian companies also got creative with marketing. They didn't just sell milk, they sold a story. Packaging proudly displayed Canadian flags, farm family photos, and promises of hormone-free, antibiotic-free production. In urban Mexican markets, where middle-class families are increasingly willing to pay more for premium products, this branding hit the sweet spot. Mexico's public rejection of US milk shipments in June 2025. The tipping point came in June 2025. Mexican port authorities rejected multiple large shipments of U.S. milk, citing quality inconsistencies, high prices, and tariff-related cost inflation. The news made front-page headlines in Mexico, sparking debates on television and social media, and the symbolism was impossible to miss. U.S. dairy wasn't just being replaced quietly, it was being publicly turned away as a matter of national policy. For U.S. exporters, the damage was catastrophic. Contracts were canceled, orders dried up, and distributors who once swore by American dairy switched loyalties overnight. Canadian suppliers, already waiting in the wings, ramped up shipments to make sure there were no shortages and even launched promotional campaigns to highlight their reliability. This was the moment the market flipped, and there was no going back. The financial strain on U.S. farmers, rural banks, and cold chain logistics. The economic fallout has been devastating across America's dairy belt. States like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and California, which rely heavily on dairy exports to Mexico, are reporting steep revenue losses. With one of their biggest customers gone, farmers are facing a glut of unsold milk, which is pushing domestic prices down. That price collapse is hammering rural economies. Dairy farming is capital-intensive, requiring expensive equipment, constant feed supply, and year-round labor. Without export revenue, many farmers can't keep up with loan payments. Rural banks, which depend on those payments to survive, are reporting rising defaults. And it's not just farms. Cold chain logistics companies, the refrigerated transport networks that keep dairy products fresh during long hauls, are losing contracts by the dozens. Trucking companies that specialized in Mexico-bound dairy shipments are parking rigs in their lots with no work. How consumer demand in Mexico is reshaping trade priorities. There's another factor here that makes the U.S. loss even more permanent. Mexican consumer preferences are changing, and Canada is better positioned to meet them. Over the past decade, demand for organic milk, specialty cheeses, and lactose-free options has exploded in Mexico's urban centers, driven by a growing middle class and greater health awareness. Younger consumers, especially in cities like Mexico City, Monterrey, and Guadalajara, are actively seeking products that align with international quality standards and environmental responsibility. Canadian producers, operating under a system that already emphasizes quality over volume, have been quick to adapt to these niche markets. They've rolled out product lines tailored specifically to Mexican tastes, from queso fresco made with Canadian milk to flavored yogurts designed for local palates. U.S. producers, on the other hand, have largely stuck to bulk commodity exports, which leaves them vulnerable when buyers start demanding variety, transparency, and premium quality. This consumer shift is now influencing Mexican trade priorities. Retailers are building entire supply chains around Canadian products, investing in Canadian-Mexican joint ventures, hosting in-store tastings, and even adjusting store layouts to highlight Canadian brands at eye level. Why Canada's integrated strategy in Mexico is built for permanence. What Canada has pulled off in Mexico isn't a short-term trade win, it's a blueprint for permanent market capture. They're not just shipping dairy, they're embedding their industry into Mexico's economy and culture. Canadian companies are partnering with Mexican distributors to co-brand products for local markets. They're sponsoring cultural festivals, investing in Mexican dairy processing plants, and even offering training programs for Mexican farmers. All of this creates a sense of partnership and mutual benefit, something that U.S. exporters, focused on transactional sales, have often overlooked. By integrating so deeply, Canada has made itself not just a supplier, but a stakeholder in Mexico's dairy future. That's a position that's nearly impossible to dislodge. The global precedent this shift sets for U.S. agriculture. Finally, we have to talk about the bigger picture, because this isn't just a U.S. Mexico-Canada story. It's a warning to every American agricultural sector. For decades, U.S. farmers have relied on the assumption that foreign markets would keep buying their goods out of habit or convenience. That assumption is now dead. Other countries are watching this dairy shakeup and realizing they don't need to be dependent on the U.S. If Canada can take over Mexico's dairy imports in a year, what's stopping Brazil from replacing U.S. soybeans in China? Or Australia from taking over wheat exports to Southeast Asia? And that's the full story of how a single round of tariffs flipped an entire market and left the U.S. dairy belt scrambling. But what do you think? Was this an unavoidable consequence of tough trade politics, or could the U.S. have stopped Canada from taking over? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we read every one. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the biggest shifts in global trade. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.